Hello, good evening. This is a new lecture. This is just beautiful. Didn't quite look like this when I was here. But it's just so nice to be back. So thank you so much for having me here. It's quite emotional actually whenever I come to Cardiff. It's such a great city, but I have so many happy memories and great friends, lifelong friends. And it just feels kind of full circle to be able to come here today and share with you some of my experience, not only as a journalist for over 20 years at the BBC, but also a citizen journalist as well. And in particular, what I've been focusing on in the last year or two or three, disinformation. And misinformation, disinformation, fake news, what is it all about? How do we navigate it? And who do we trust? Well, if I knew all the answers to that, I'd be very wealthy. Probably be like Elon Musk, wouldn't I? But I'm going to share with you my observations and what I've learned as a journalist and a global citizen. And actually what I firmly believe to be a course of action, I think, that we can all take to deal with the disinformation cycle that we are in right now, at the moment, this very second. I recently presented a podcast for BBC World Service and BBC Radio 4. It's available now on BBC Sounds. Any more BBC mentions I can put into a sentence, I will. But it's called Whose Truth? And I had the privilege of delving deep into the critical issue of disinformation, speaking with global experts from various fields and Nobel Prize winners. But before I begin, I think it's really important to start with a definition of what is disinformation. And in order to do that, I'm going to use a credible source, Professor Martin Innes. I'm going to take your words, which I know you stand by, to explain what disinformation is. And Professor Innes says, disinformation is information that, when communicated, is designed to deliberately mislead someone about the facts. It matters because it impacts our trust in institutions and in each other. It's changing the social ordering of reality and therefore poses a serious threat to democracy. Martin, I think you're right, which is good news. Well, maybe not good news, but I'll explain why, really, in the 10 minutes or so, why I agree with Martin that it does pose a serious threat to democracy and indeed what we can do to navigate it. But before we even start, let's take a little step back and talk about digital media and when it first emerged. And, I'm sure many of you may remember that, when Twitter was coming out and it was being used as a tool for journalists, we kind of held it as a tool for liberation and democracy. Yet increasingly, we've seen it become a tool of repression and a weapon used against, for example, activists and journalists all over the world. And also, and this is really, for me, a point of interest, women in politics. Now, this shift is particularly concerning when we consider the gendered nature of disinformation. In fact, I'm going to argue with you here today that the gender disinformation should be treated for all of us as an early warning system. Why? Well, it often precedes broader disinformation campaigns targeting women in positions of power as influence, with the aim of silencing and discrediting female voices. Now, this pattern, by the way, isn't just a women's issue. It's a canary in the coal mine for the health of our information ecosystem, I believe, as a whole. Now, in the podcast, I interviewed a number of Nobel Prize winners about how disinformation impacts their work. One of the people I spoke to, remarkable woman, Filipino journalist, Maria Ressa, and she shared her experiences with me about online harassment. She was subjugated to prolific online harassment and indeed its political impact under the Rodrigo Duterte regime, the dictator that is Rodrigo Duterte. Then I spoke to the Nobel Prize winner, the scientist Kathleen Carrico, who told me all about the challenges that she faced during the COVID-19 pandemic around vaccine disinformation. And, this really thrust her into the spotlight because she was busy developing a vaccine. But she was targeted for being a woman and also what she was doing in terms of the disinformation cycle and what people believed that she wasn't saying that was truthful. And then I spoke to Sir Paul Nurse, the geneticist, who addressed the issue of climate change denial and its impact on the scientific discourse. Now, these are all big shifts, not only in political discourse, but ultimately in all of our lives. And one particularly poignant conversation that I had with one of the contributors in this 3-part episode of this series, Whose Truth, was Alexandra Matvichuk from the Center for Civil Liberties in Ukraine. We discussed her work on human rights and war crimes and the information war that Russia was waging against Ukraine. But you know what was really worrying was really listening to her and understanding how the conflict had highlighted how somebody can use disinformation in this current conflict to deny atrocities, to sow confusion, and ultimately manipulate public opinion on a global scale. And that happens through a device. I also interviewed a few years back the cybersecurity expert Mikko Hipponen. He is insane, this man. He was, way back when, 1970s and 1980s, he was helping Microsoft develop their Windows program. He knows everything about everything. And he parted with us as we, finished this interview. He said, there's just one thing I want to say about social media, AI, and everything else. That perhaps the most important metaphor for data is uranium. And he went on to say it's highly valuable and dangerous. Its radiation is lethal, and maybe it's lethal forever. And you know what? This analogy becomes particularly pertinent even when we consider that it's not necessarily governments that have the power. It is actually the new leaders of the world that have the power, our power. Elon Musk. So there we are thinking about Trump and Putin and all the rest of it. But are we really thinking about those that own our data, the Elon Musks of the world, who can now wield unprecedented control over our data and information channels? I want to share with you something that Elon Musk tweeted on Sunday evening this week. This is what he wrote. Good rule of thumb. Those who frequently use the word disinformation are the ones most likely to be pushing it. So I've been using the word quite a lot, so I'm pushing disinformation, am I? Let's talk about Elon Musk for a moment. His acquisition of Twitter, now X, has raised significant concerns about the spread of disinformation. His platform has been used to amplify false claims, reaching billions of views. Now, a study published in August this year by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, you guys probably know this, you've been looking at it, found that Musk's false or misleading posts about the US election have amassed nearly 1.2 billion views in 2024 alone. Moreover, Musk has shared manipulated content without proper disclaimers, potentially misleading millions of viewers, in fact, violating X's own policy about manipulated content. And I really wanted to share that with you because the urgency of addressing disinformation cannot be overstated. We need to act now. Major elections and global conflicts, they are taking place as we speak around the world, and all of them, bar none, are shaped by how disinformation enters our social system. It's not just about politics. It's about our shared reality and our ability to make informed decisions as a society. And we cannot, by the way, have this conversation without talking about artificial intelligence. It is changing the landscape, AI really is. And AI tools have made it alarmingly easy to create and spread disinformation at an unprecedented scale. These systems can generate human-like text, convincing fake news articles, and even manipulated video content, making it increasingly difficult for the average person to distinguish between fact and fiction. So this brings us, I suppose, to a really critical question today. Who is in charge of these AI systems, and how diverse are the teams who are actually developing them? Well, the lack of diversity in AI development teams is a significant concern. When homogeneous groups create AI systems, they often fail to account for experiences and perspectives of marginalized communities. And that leads ultimately to systems that perpetuate or exacerbate existing societal biases. For instance, facial recognition systems, right? They've shown higher error rates for women and people of color due to inadequate representation in training data sets. People like me are not represented. My face would not be recognized on an AI algorithm. Similarly, language models trained primarily on English language data may struggle to accurately represent or understand cultural nuances from, other parts of the world. Now, what do we do? Well, we've got to address these issues. We need to push for greater diversity and inclusion in AI development teams. And it's not just about racial or gender diversity, but also about diversity in terms of socioeconomic background, disability status, and cultural perspectives. And ultimately, by bringing a wider range of experiences to the table, we can create AI systems that are more equitable and are less prone to harmful biases, I think. And you know what? AI does offer potential solutions as well. It can be harnessed, and it is being harnessed actually at the moment, to detect misinformation effectively. But the key for me lies in responsible development and increased media literacy among the public. So what can we do? How do we navigate the beast that is disinformation? Well, as journalists, academics, students, global citizens, we've got to remain vigilant. We've got to support fact-checking initiatives. We've got to promote media literacy. We've got to encourage critical thinking. Have we not? We've got to question our sources, even if it is the BBC. We've got to treat everybody the same. We've got to cross-reference information. We've got to be willing to change our mind when presented with credible evidence. Each of us has the power to make a difference in this fight against disinformation. I don't want it to be sounding kind of very negative, but, disinformation isn't just a buzzword. It really does pose a danger to our democratic institutions and social fabric, as Professor Martin I quoted at the start of this conversation. And by understanding its mechanisms and impact, alongside advocating for diversity in both tech leadership and AI development, we can work towards building a more resilient and informed society. It's not just that we can, we have to. We must work towards that goal. And I'm really pleased to say that Cardiff University is leading the way globally in tackling and navigating disinformation. But, we can trust again, but we must ensure that we navigate disinformation with our eyes wide open. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.